Hello, family. Thanks for journeying with me here on another Sunday in the Scriptures as we journey through the Gospel of John in the fifth Sunday of Eastertide. And today's reading comes from John chapter 13, verse 31 through 35. And as it reads, "When Judas had left them, Jesus said, 'Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself. And God will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little while longer. I give you a new commandment. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you also should love one another. This is how all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.'" The Gospel of the Lord. I love when we get these short readings. We really get an opportunity to kind of unpack each line and really kind of take into heart what Jesus is trying to communicate to us, his modern day disciples. So here in John chapter 13, the context is Jesus is at the Last Supper. So this is during the Last Supper, right before the institution of the Eucharist. So that means it's the night before Jesus is arrested, and it's just days before he goes to the cross. And we learn here in the first line that Judas had just left him. Judas has just left to go betray Jesus. So now Jesus is with his faithful 11, and he says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." And what does that mean? Judas has just left to go betray him, and Jesus says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." And he's referring to his passion. This is the very beginning of his passion. And that's where Jesus will be paradoxically glorified on the cross. And now it's about to start. And no one knows it. No one can understand it. And it looks like Jesus is about to start losing everything, and everything is about to start going wrong as Jesus is going to get arrested and betrayed and condemned and whipped and beaten and crowned with thorns and carrying his cross, and he falls and then he gets crucified. It looks like this is about to be a terrible few days, and it really is. But Jesus knows that this is what he must do. Jesus is living for an audience of one. He says, "I came not to do my own will, but the will of the one who sent me." Jesus' only concern is doing the Father's will. And he's not concerned in how it looks to everyone else, because to everyone else, it looks like he's a fraud. It looks like he's losing. It looks like he's going to lose and be defeated by his enemies. But that's not the case. And Jesus isn't even concerned with defending himself and telling everybody why he must do this and all that stuff. No, he's concerned with doing the will of God. And the second half of that statement is, "And God is glorified in him." God is glorified in the obedience of Jesus. And God is glorified in our obedience as well, as we follow after Jesus. In obedience, I speak about it so much because it's in so much part of the Gospels and of the message of Jesus, and that we are to be obedient to the Father, but also to keep in mind always that the Father loves us and will never ask anything of us that isn't for our good and his glorification. So God has a plan, and it was unknown to the world. And this plan was to save the world through the cross of Jesus, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. This was God's plan. And no one knew it, and it was unknown, but it was brought to its completion. It was brought to its fulfillment by the obedience of Jesus, even when it was difficult. Even when Jesus is sweating blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, "Father, all things are possible with you. Take this cup away from me, yet not my will be done, Father, but yours be done." So as Jesus goes to the cross, his obedience glorifies God, and God responds by glorifying the Son, right? And we learn this in Philippians. In Philippians 2, verse 9, Paul writes, Therefore, meaning because of his obedience, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name." By Jesus being obedient to the Father and giving glory to him, the Father gives glory to the Son. And I think we see, not in the same way, of course, but I think we see a small kind of version of this in the saints, in that the saints are obedient to God and to fulfilling and trying their best to fulfill the plan that God has for their life. And in a unique way, they don't glorify themselves, but God glorifies them and holds them up that we would strive to be like them, that we would use them as examples in our life. to say, man, he really did the will of God. He really cooperated with God's grace. I want to do that. That's a living example for me to strive after. So they would want no glory for themselves, but God kind of makes them known to us, saints of the past and saints of the present and, not so long ago. Saints like St. Teresa of Calcutta, St. Francis of Assisi, and all the beautiful saints of our tradition that say, man, they really fulfilled God's will for their life. And now God is kind of not elevating them like he did Jesus, of course, but in a unique way, he's kind of saying, hey, they did it. They did it. It's possible for you to do it too. And then Jesus goes on and says, I will only be with you a little while longer, meaning that he's going to the cross and he will not be with them in the same way that he was. And he says, I give you a new commandment. And this is interesting, and we could easily breeze over this. I give you a new commandment. Well, only God gives commandments, right? We learn in the Old Testament that God gave Moses the commandments, and Moses communicated those to the people. David never gave commandments. Abraham, the father of faith, never gave commandments. Only God gives the commandments. And here Jesus is saying, I give you a new commandment. So this is a subtle way of Jesus claiming his divinity. And then he says, as I have loved you, so you also should love one another. Well, how did Jesus love us? By laying down his life. Jesus loved us by going to the cross. He didn't want to do it. He says, Father, take this cup away. I don't want to do this, Father. If there's another way, please let it be done. I don't want to do this. But he did it. Not because he needed to do it, because we needed him to do it. We needed it. That's the love of God, that he didn't need to go to that cross. He did it for us. He laid down his life for us. And I think of some of the great saints, like I think of Maximilian Kolbe. You can read his story and watch videos, documentaries on him. And he stepped in to take the place. Someone was going in the Nazi concentration camps in World War II. Someone was chosen to die, and he had a family. And Maximilian Kolbe stepped in his place and was killed, and the other guy was allowed to live and actually got to see his family again. I think of St. Damien of Molokai, who I believe was from Belgium and went to the island of Molokai where they basically put everyone with leprosy. And he went and said mass for them and heard their confessions and anointed their bodies and gave them proper burials, and eventually contracted the disease himself and died from leprosy. These people, these great saints, laid down their life. And now we're called to imitate this, maybe not in such a radical way as Maximilian Kolbe or St. Damien of Molokai, but in some unique way, we are all called to imitate Jesus, because he says, as I have loved you, he loved us by laying down his life, self-sacrificing himself for us. So this way we should also love one another. And this is a challenge, because love is an action. It's self-sacrificing. It's willing the good of the other, as St. Thomas Aquinas defines it. So it's not necessarily an emotion, but an act of the will. It's a choice that we make. And I think of parents, right, that are constantly loving their children and getting up in the middle of the night to do whatever they need to do when their children cries out for them. And they don't want to do it, but they do it because they love them. They will their good. They're making a choice, an act of the will. I think about the corporal works of mercy. I think about clothing the naked and giving water to the drink to the thirsty, and visit the imprisoned and burying the dead. All the corporal works of mercy are acts of the will, even when we don't feel like it. And this is difficult, right? Because we're called to this kind of love. Jesus doesn't say, just do this for the people you're friends with. He actually teaches the opposite. He says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. He uses the example of the Good Samaritan as well. So we're called to this kind of extreme love to all, to people that disagree with us, to people that we don't like, to people that we'd rather not be around. We're called to love them as Jesus has loved us. And really, we owe everyone love because of the love that God has poured into our hearts and what Jesus has done for us in saving us and setting us free by his sacrifice. And now we're called to be his disciples, to go and imitate him and love each other in this way. And then Jesus says, this is how all will know that you are my disciples. And notice how he doesn't say, They will know you're my disciples by how much you pray or how much you read or how many Bible verses you've memorized or how many Bible studies you go to or whatever. And those are all good things. And I want to do all those things for the rest of my life. And all these are very good. And I would even say that they're all necessary, but they're not the means to the end. The end is love. So our prayer, our reading, our study, our Bible studies, our readings of Scripture, everything like that should lead to us culminating in a greater act of love, a love of God and a love of neighbor. And this is how we can make Jesus known. He says, this is how people are going to know that you belong to me, because you love like this, and the world doesn't love like this. So this is how we can make Jesus known, by the way we love one another, even our enemies. This is how we can represent him. This is how we can be his hands and his feet and his mouth. And we can be Jesus here on earth by loving one another. And this is the fulfillment of the commandments. Jesus says to love God and to love neighbor is ultimately to fulfill the commandments. And again, this is action. In Matthew 7:24, Jesus says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. So not just hears these words of mine and thinks that they're good ideas, but hears them and does them. So we're not just called to believe, we're called to believe the words, to internalize them, and then to act on them. But we always have to remember that apart from him, we can do nothing. So it's really him, by his grace, working in our life, that we choose to cooperate with his grace. We choose to say, God, I want to love how you love. Please help me. I choose you, Jesus. So we call on him and we allow him to work in us as we cooperate with his grace. And I just want to end with Jesus speaking in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. Jesus says, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So let us go out this week, brothers and sisters, in the power of the Holy Spirit, looking for ways to love one another as he has loved us. May God always bless and protect you. Please pray for me as I pray for you.